So I recently smoked an entire brisket as part of a different video in which I make brisket burnt ends cowboy pinto beans. And one of the steps of making a whole brisket like this is doing quite a bit of trimming, and that leaves me with a lot of leftover fat to do something with. Save it for sausages or my burger grind, that's all good, but there's a lot of fat, more than I really need for the amount of trimmed meat I have to work with. So what do I do with all of that fat? I render it down into a beautiful jar of beef tallow. It's really pretty simple to do, and in this video, I'm going to show you exactly how I did it. After I've trimmed up my brisket and got it on the smoker, I'll further break down all the stuff I trimmed off. All I'm trying to do here is separate any distinguishable hunks of meat from stuff that is all fat, or mostly fat. There's quite a bit of both here in this trim pile, but it only takes a couple minutes to get it all separated. When I'm done, I've got a heap of nice fatty meat that I'll end up using for burgers, and I've got a heap of beef fat. No need to get too crazy or meticulous on this step. You can see there's still some little bits of meat throughout the fat pieces, and that's perfectly fine. Now I'll just put the meat in the fridge and start breaking down the fat. Using my knife, I'm just going to start cutting each hunk of fat down into very small little pieces. Some people use a meat grinder for this step, and that works great. But for this single pile of fat, I don't feel like setting up my grinder, cleaning every piece of it when I'm done, and putting it all back away. So I'll just slice away, cutting it all up into small little fat cubes. And now we're moving this operation outside. Using my big Enamel Dutch oven, I'll just throw in all those bits of fat and turn the stove on to about as low as it can get. I'll then pour in somewhere between 1/2 to 1 cup of water, and now it's just a matter of letting it heat up and start rendering. I'll mention that I highly recommend doing this outside if you are able, because while the smell of rendering beef fat isn't overly offensive, it's sure not something I want my entire house smelling like for the next few days. Anyway, we'll check in every hour or so to see how it's progressing. After 1 hour, you can see that the fat has started browning quite a bit, and some liquid has been released from the little bits of meat still in there. I'll give it all a little bit of a stir to make sure nothing's stuck on the bottom of the pot, and just let it cook away. After 2 hours, everything's simmering away nicely, and you can definitely see some of the fat starting to render and liquefy. And by the way, you don't want this to be boiling. A low, gentle simmer is what you're looking for. My heat is turned as low as it can go on this stove. If you cook it too hot, you'll risk burning the fat, which you definitely don't want. After 3 hours, we're definitely looking good, and it won't be a whole lot longer before this is done. There's still a little moisture in there, and the fat hasn't quite fully rendered down, so we'll give it a bit longer. Okay, here we are at the 4-hour mark, and I'm turning off the heat. That's about as rendered as it's gonna get, and it's looking pretty good to me. All of the chunks in there are just those little bits of meat that were stuck throughout the fat that have now been essentially deep fried in beef fat. After letting it all cool for just a little while, we're back in the kitchen and it's time to start straining. Using my big slotted spoon thingy, I'll scoop as many of those little fried meat bits out as I can. And then I'll pour what's left in the pot through a mesh strainer funnel to separate out basically 99% of any remaining solids. Finally, the last step in filtering that tallow. Normally I would use a couple layers of cheesecloth for this, but I am fresh out, so I'll use a piece of terry cloth instead. A coffee filter would also work, though that will likely filter much more slowly and make this step take way longer. Now I'll just pour that filtered fat into a mason jar. The fat I trimmed from one large brisket rendered down into pretty much exactly 1 pint of beef tallow. Now I'll just let this jar sit on the counter until it's cooled down quite a bit. Oh, and remember those little bits of deep fried meat we scooped out earlier? Do yourself a favor and sprinkle a little salt on a handful of those and snack on them while they're still warm. I can't even tell you how tasty these little bits of crispy caramelized brisket meat are. I promise you'll want to eat about 1,000 of them, even if you can practically feel your heart valves seizing up while doing so. Anyhow, once that tallow is pretty much down to room temperature, I'll throw a lid on the jar and stick the whole thing in the refrigerator. When cold, the tallow becomes solid and white and is ready to use for whatever cooking fat application I need. So that's all there is to it. Cut up the fat really small or put it through a grinder, throw it in a pot, mix in just a little bit of water, simmer it super slow for about 4 hours, Skim out all the little brown bits, strain it all through some kind of mesh or cheesecloth or terry cloth, pour it into a mason jar, let it solidify, throw it in the fridge, and use it anytime between now and a few months from now. And seriously, try that thing with the sprinkling the salt on the little crunchy bits. You're going to wish that I didn't tell you about that. So that's about it. Be sure to like and subscribe and stay up to date with all our latest stuff, including cooking and food and barbecue and smoking videos. And consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/Great Lakes Country. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'm John, and this is Great Lakes Country.